Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining the first edition of Office Hours with a SailPoint expert dedicated exclusively to File Access Manager or FAM. My name is Savio D'Souza, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Joining me is Fani Karne, who is a senior solution architect from our FAM professional services team. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. All participants have been placed on mute during the presentation. Please submit any questions you may have in the Q&A box. We will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. Also, please note, this session will be recorded. We'll email you a link of the recording to Compass after the presentation. Now, before I can pass it over to Funny, allow me to give you a short background to today's session. A lot of you enjoy our office hours or Q&A hours that focus on identity IQ. We've received many requests for a similar exercise that is devoted to FAM, and here we are today. We hope to have these every month. I would also like to point out that these sessions are open to participants across the globe, AMS, EMEA, APAC. All right, now, over to you, Funny.
Thanks, Savio. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Greetings, everyone, all across the globe. I hope everyone is doing just fine. Today, we're here to talk about some File Access Manager stuff, maintenance and operations. Basically, the idea here is to say if you've already have an implementation, we just want to kind of talk about things you can do to, maintain your environment as well as operationalize your environment going forward, and then, feed it into your business processes. I want to make this pretty discussion heavy. So the slides I'll try to go through real fast, and then we'll try to leave as much time as possible at the end for questions. Savio, how's the volume?
It's fine, Funny. I think
cool.
We're good.
All right, so the agenda today, just do a brief intro to myself and File Access Manager. We'll talk about maintenance. We'll talk about operationalization, and then we'll just have some questions. So for an intro, we'll start with myself. I'm Pani Karne. I'm a senior solution architect on the professional services side for File Access Manager. I've been doing File Access Manager implementations for over 3 years now. Been doing implementation since version 4.2, which is several years ago now. And I've seen the product change in many ways. I have a range of experience in different implementations and enterprises. Before we get too deep into it, what is File Access Manager? Just quickly, the whole SailPoint vision is identity governance. We want to know what access the identity has and what they're doing with that access. Traditionally, this is applications and infrastructure. That's what you see on the left-hand side. This is the traditional realm of identity IQ, where we're, hooking up into structured systems and analyzing the access that exists there. But we know that there's a lot of data. According to Gartner, 80% of all data in enterprises is unstructured. And so it makes sense from the identity perspective to understand what access the identity has to in terms of, unstructured access. So these could be file servers, SharePoint, NetApps, Isilons, and even the cloud stuff now. So OneDrive, SharePoint Online, Exchange Online. A lot of people are moving data to the cloud. So there's a lot of unstructured data there as well. So we will scan those as well. And then the idea here is to get that information and then relate it back to the identity context. So File Access Manager does three things that are like the core functionality of the product. It does permissions collection, which is just looking at who has access to what, right? So who has access to this folder, who has access to this SharePoint document. Then also identifying what's sensitive, the crown jewels, right? Like, so if, there's all these documents in SharePoint, do any of them have sensitive data like credit card numbers or account numbers or social security numbers? And then the last thing is real-time activity monitoring. So the permissions collection and data classification those are task-based. We launch a scan, it goes and scans whatever target system that you're trying to scan, and then it'll bring that information back. Real-time activity monitoring is more of a listener. This is, picking up activity as it happens on the endpoint and then bringing that back into our system so that we can take action with it. So 3 things: permissions, data classification, and activity monitoring. Those are the 3 core functionalities of File Access Manager. How does that work? So for permissions collection, we have a permissions collector server that does the crawl task. This is what really initiates everything. We'll go to the target applications here, right? So in case of a file share, we'll have the permissions collector scan a file share and then go under all of those children and then figure out the directory structure. That follows with a permissions collection task. So when everything that we've crawled, all these folders, we're going to go ahead and collect permissions on them, and that's the permissions collection task. These are 2 different tasks, crawls and permissions, and they're just, you launch them on a schedule, or you launch them at once, or you can do whatever you want with that, but they are task-based. Even data classification, once you've crawled everything, right? So we've crawled, we've collected permissions. Once you've crawled anything, you can also collect, sensitive information from it. So figure out, is there PII, PCI, GDPR, social security numbers, any sensitive data? We can go out to that folder, open the file, and figure out if there's anything sensitive in there. This is really valuable because, as we discussed, 80% of all enterprise data is unstructured. That could mean petabytes and petabytes of data. Where do you start when you're looking at the most risk? And so you want to start at the sensitive stuff. So those are tasks. The flow looks like this. We have an endpoint here on the left. That could be a file server, SharePoint, whatever. The permissions collector service will crawl it. That will result in a business resource. That's what we call either a folder for file servers, or a SharePoint site, or an Exchange mailbox. So the business service is File Access Manager terminology for an object where we're collecting permissions or classifying data. And so the permissions collector will do the crawl, get the business service. Once you have the business service, you can do one of 2 things. You can collect permissions on that. So for this folder, who has access, get those permissions and do permissions analysis. Or you can say, for this folder, what kind of classification should I give it, right? So what sensitive data exists in here, and you can do forensics on that. So the flow is, you crawl it, you have a business resource. Once you have the business resource, you can collect permissions from it, or you can classify data on it. And these are a task-based, all of these. And I run by the permissions collector service or the data classification service. You can make these tasks run faster by adding additional services for parallel processing. That's what these use, the RabbitMQ mechanism, where the collectors do the heavy lifting and then post the results back into the queue, which then gets put into our database. We want to talk about activity monitoring flow. So as we discussed with permissions, crawling, and data classification, those are task-based, so you have to launch those. Real-time activity monitoring, you just install the service, the activity monitoring service, and you'll be able to collect activities from endpoints. So in this example, John Doe read a file. It's called merchantdetails.pdf, and it's in the server 1 $D accounting folder. And so that's what you get from the file server itself, right? So if you look at the file server, you can say, oh, John.Doe read this file, and you get that once every 60 seconds. You go ahead and pull the endpoint. Okay, so that's the activity monitoring service. That does it every 60 seconds. That is configurable. You can do it faster, you can do it slower, but it basically says every 60 seconds what all activity has occurred on this endpoint, and then brings that back. The flow there looks something like this. So we'll have the endpoints here at the target application on the left-hand side. From there, our activity monitoring monitor will pick up an activity and that's based on the polling interval. And you can set up exclusions here, meaning you can get rid of activities if you don't want to keep them. So by default, we collect a certain a number of activities or certain activities from the target application. You can choose to exclude certain activities based on certain criteria at the activity monitor level, but the activity monitor doesn't give you context of the identity, like from Identity IQ or AD. And so that gets sent to the event manager, which then processes that event. Once that event gets processed, we can choose to discard it, meaning we don't care about it, or we can choose to, enrich it or alert on it. And then once we decide to keep that, we can go ahead and put it into the Elasticsearch and SQL databases. So the SQL database has all the activities that occur, but they're a compressed backup. We don't really query SQL when we're doing activity forensics in the website. You're hitting Elasticsearch because it's much easier to search through millions of activities in Elasticsearch than it is SQL. SQL has those activities as a backup in case something happens to Elasticsearch and you need to restore. So that's the activity monitoring flow. The activity monitor will pick up the activity, it'll send it to the event manager, and the event manager will send it to the Elasticsearch and the SQL databases. All right, so that's a quick intro of what File Access Manager is and how things work. So let's talk about, once you've stood this up, how do you maintain this? What's the best way to, tackle certain issues? I'm seeing some questions come up on the QA, but I guess.
Would you like to take some questions? Okay. Funny, we have around 3 questions related to this section. First one,
sure.
Permissions collection. Does it pull this info? No, 1 minute, let me, yeah. Does permissions collection, does it pull this info for all the folders in the system, or is it only modified folder? This is considering a file share as endpoint.
Yeah, so the permissions collector will pick up anything that has been crawled, right? So you set, for a file share, you crawl it, you get the tree structure. This is what that tree structure looks like. And then the permissions collection will go and fetch the permissions or the ACLs, really, that exist on these folders. And it doesn't take into account, modified dates or anything like that, because it doesn't need to. It just knows this folder exists. I need to go see what permissions exist on that folder. Modifications and alerting and auditing, that falls more under the realm of activity monitoring.
We have a couple of few more questions. Let's just go over these quickly.
Sure.
Does the monitoring service have an impact on the file system performance?
No, so it will actually, it'll have some impact, but not much. So if you talk about a file share, right? So the activity monitoring service lives on a FAM server for every case except for a Windows file server. That's the only agent, a Windows file server activity monitor. That's the only one that goes on a Windows file server or the target application itself. Everything else is remote. It's a remote agent that lives on one of our File Access Manager servers. So in terms of the activity monitor itself, it won't take up that many resources on the FAM server itself. And in terms of impact on the endpoint, we don't see much. Like I think Matt mentioned it here. 1 to 2% CPU utilization, even on a Windows file server. It's not much RAM usage. Even in the case of very large organizations where they could have millions of activities, there are controls in place to impact that performance. Right? We can control what activities we pick up. We can control what activities the endpoint sends in certain cases. So impact should be very minimal. And in the case where there's just an extraordinary amount of activities and the file server is not managed properly, there are controls in place to limit the impact as well.
All right, let's get back to the presentation.
Okay, cool. Was there another question, or is that it?
We'll go with the questions. We have questions coming in, and I'll request all our participants to share their questions in the Q&A box. Yeah, let's continue the presentation for now.
Okay, cool. All right, so moving on to maintenance stuff. So the first place you'll start in terms of maintenance, right, is the health center. This is basically where you want to start to get an idea of how your system is performing. This is available in the administrative client. Green means the service is installed and running fine. Gray means the service is not installed. If these were gray, red or yellow indicate some kind of problem with the service. And so like if you want to know, generally speaking, how your system is doing, you want to go into the health center, make sure that everything is green. That's the simplest thing to kind of recommend if you want to see how your environment is doing. You can have another color here. It's blue. That's if you have a disaster recovery service. So let's say if you had two, Elasticsearches or two user interfaces, you can have one as disaster recovery. So if one goes down, the secondary one can be made the active one. And then so that's for DR purposes, but mainly you just want to go to the health center, see everything green. If something is not green, or if a task is failing, or if you see certain other errors, then where do you go? You go to Compass. So this is another good starting point. So there's been a lot of effort put into making this File Access Manager maintenance guide and making sure that it covers a wide range of issues that we see out in the field in terms of maintenance, right? So you'd want to go here. So I'm here right now. So this is that website. If you go to that link, you'll come to this File Access Manager guide. This is basically in the document section of File Access Manager. And there's several things here. We'll run through a few of them to talk, to show what they're doing, right? So the first thing I think that's useful here is a component overview. If you don't know what a service is used for or what it's doing, you can come into this component overview, and this page breaks it down by different deployment models. Obviously, your architecture could be slightly different from this depending on what you're doing, but generally speaking, this page does a great job of explaining what each service does, why it's there, and what we use it for. So if you ever have questions, I'd probably start here, get a component overview, and then figure out, okay, so what kind of issue am I seeing, right? So the idea is to figure out if you have a problem, right? If a service is yellow or red, or if a task is failing, you want to figure out what's going on. You got to figure out which component is responsible for it, right? So if your permissions collections are failing, then you probably want to look at your permissions collector service. If your UI is having problems, then it's probably your user interface service. And so far and so forth. You want to know what each of these services are responsible for so that you can find, then you can, if you have a problem, you find out where to look. Once you find out where the problem is, you'll probably want to do a few things. You'll stop and start services. This could be done in the case of like a hung task, or if the communication went down and the database connection is severed and we need to kind of resuscitate it. There are instances where you'll need to start and stop services, not in a normal operation period, but there'll also be times where you'll start and stop services based on patching cycles, right? Like, so once a month you might patch all your Windows servers, so these need to be started. There is a specific sequence that we would like you to do that in, because certain services depend on other services being up. So, if you find out you have a problem with a service or a task, first thing you want to probably do is look at that service, and if something's wrong with it, just give it a restart. It's probably the most basic thing that you can try. And if that resolves your issue, great, right? So you started your services, then your task ran, or the communication is back up, then great. You might want to find out why that communication went down in the first place. You'll find that in the logs, but starting and stopping your services, could just resolve your problem. There's other sections here that talk about different services, specific services, right? So what are the core services? What do they do? How can you, manage those? How can you install those? How can you move those? Sometimes you have to move servers or services. And so again, if that's the case, you want to go to this maintenance guide, and it talks about very nicely how to move a service, install a service, uninstall a service, or troubleshoot a service, right? So this, if you've isolated your problem to a specific service and you don't know what to do next, then there's some troubleshooting steps here that could potentially tell you what's going on. If the logs don't indicate a specific error, if it's something catastrophic like a communication, you'll definitely see that error in the logs. But if you don't, and it's, if the error doesn't make sense, then you can raise the log level of that service, of any service, by editing its config file. This gives you more information, and then hopefully with more of that information, you can decide what is the problem and then address it. So there's event managers, how to do collectors and engines. So this is how do you add collectors, how do you remove collectors, what do they mean? So the engine collector combination, right? So you might have to add more collectors to an engine or remove collectors from an engine and give it to something else to kind of distribute the processing power. This is a good resource to look at that, right? So why, understand how many, the sizing process is different, right? So this is not sizing. I know I saw a question earlier of, is there a way we can find out how much database space we need or how many resources that we need? That's usually done in the sizing process, but that might change depending on your implementation. So if you have 5 file servers that you're targeting right now, but a few months down the line you expand that out to, I don't know, 100 or 200, then you want to kind of think about how many more collectors and engines that you'll need, and this is how you'll move those. There's RabbitMQ and Elasticsearch. These you probably won't touch as much, but if you want, these links also walk you through how to move those, uninstall those, and troubleshoot if there's anything wrong there. Okay, so all this other stuff is just you're going into each of the services and how to maintain those specific services. So what is the general idea here? Check your health center, make sure everything is green. Check your tasks, make sure everything is running fine. If your tasks aren't running fine, or if your services aren't behaving properly, then you want to find out what's wrong. You want to start at the health center. If you can't figure it out there, or if you can get an idea of what's going on there, then you want to come to this maintenance guide and figure out which service is the problem and how to troubleshoot it. Okay, so that was maintenance. I'm going to go into operationalization, which is taking those maintenance ideas and ideas about what we learned about the crawls and the permissions and the services, and putting in controls in place to kind of automate some of that maintenance and make it easier for you guys to maintain File Access Manager. So I'll be talking about that now. So, understanding how you want to operate, it means understanding what is in scope, right? So first you obviously need to decide, by now you should have done at least, if you're this far into it, you should have had at least a few crawls and permissions collections completed. You should have a few activities flowing in, and you should have some data classification results if you went through a typical project. And so at that point, you can kind of say, okay, this is all the data that I've collected. This is all the resources that I have. And when I say resources, I usually think about these 3 things, right? Disk space, CPU, and memory. These are what each of the services use to do their jobs. And so we want to think about how can we best leverage the resources that we have. And that's by understanding each service and the job that they're doing, right? So most of the general services, core servers and core services, they're sitting there in the background, not doing too much, but they will take up a little bit of memory and CPU usage, not too much in disk space. Where you'll see a lot of disk space being used is Elasticsearch and SQL Server, right? All the others use disk space too, but not nearly as much as SQL or Elastic. Definitely need to keep an eye on the size of your SQL databases and Elasticsearch databases. I'd say one of the most common support cases that we see is, oh, our database ran out of space, or our Elasticsearch ran out of space, or something along that line where the activities just kept flowing in and nobody kept an eye on the database disk space and it ran out. And if a SQL database runs out of disk space, everything is down. Like the whole system is down because it can't do anything. The database isn't available. You literally can't do anything. and it's not a good place to start cleaning up from. Once your database is full, it's not the easiest to get it back to a good place. Like you can start deleting stuff, but because the database is full, the application will be unavailable, and therefore it makes it harder to address that through the application. Whereas before the database fills up, you can address that through the application, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, and just get ahead of that, the database filling up. In terms of processor and memory, all services use CPU and memory. The most hungry ones are Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch, by default, when it starts, it uses some portion of the server that it's starting up on. So if you start a SQL Server service or an Elasticsearch service, on startup, they take a bunch of memory and hold on to it, and they just use that for running their services. So you might see high memory usage on a SQL Server or Elasticsearch server. That is normal, unless it's like so high where your server is not able to even stay up. That's different, but you should see 80%, 70% memory usage on or higher on SQL Server and Elasticsearch. CPU will be used by those as well, right? So the SQL Server will have a lot of CPU when you're doing a lot of reports. Like if you're running a lot of reports and a lot of tasks, and you're just hitting the database a lot and trying to write information to it and read information from it, that's when you'd see a lot of CPU on the SQL side. Same thing for Elasticsearch, but Elasticsearch is only activities. So unless you're running a lot of activities or getting a lot of activities, and when I say a lot of activities, I mean more than 2 million a day or more than 10 million activities a day, right? So once you start getting into those millions of activities, that's when it gets really, once you get into the millions of activities per day, that's when you definitely want to keep an eye on the CPU and the disk space. The other services, they also use CPU and memory. The event manager is something, again, that could have a problem with CPU and memory. The event manager, usually you have 1 per install or 2 per install. You don't have that many as like an activity monitor. You'll have an activity monitor for every application, so you could have hundreds, if not thousands, but you'd only have a handful of event manager, if not just 1. And that does a lot of processing, so you want to keep an eye on, how is the event manager doing? Or do you have a lot of policies in place that it's trying to evaluate? Is it sending out a bunch of alerts? And so the way you do that is just going onto one of these servers and looking at Task Manager. That's the simplest way to do that. Just see if the server is performing well. There are statistics logs with all the services, or most of the services have a statistics log that goes along with them. If you read the statistics log, and there should be a document. Julian Anderson made a document from the support side. He made a great document about what the statistics mean and the event managers and the activity monitor logs. The statistics files are a very good resource to find out if your service is performing fine, and if so, what kind of activity is it doing, right? So how many activities are coming in, how many resources are you collecting on, et cetera, et cetera. Statistics logs are a good place, along with Task Manager, to figure out how much processing your services are actually doing. So disk space, very important for SQL and Elastic. Processor and memory, very important for event manager, permissions collection, and data classification, and activity monitoring. And all the backend services don't really use that much of these resources unless you're doing a lot, like unless you're running, dozens of campaigns with, thousands of permissions. We typically don't see any of the general services going crazy on resources. What we do see is the SQL, Elastic, Event Manager, Elasticsearch, or the collectors themselves. And in that case, you just need to figure out, the statistics, and figure out, the statistics will also tell you if there's a backup or a bottleneck. And then from then on, you can figure out if you need additional resources. Once you look at those statistics files and the services, and you realize, okay, I have this information. So once you've looked at the statistics files and set up your configuration and have some data, you should go and look at that data and figure out what you want to keep. So in terms of crawl scoping, right? So this is the most basic type of scoping. If you scope your crawl, you're basically scoping your permissions collection and data classification, because we're only going to collect permissions and classify data on crawls, on folders that we've crawled. And you can scope the crawl in one of two ways. So as of 8.01, you can do actually three ways, but before 8.01, you would only be able to do what's called a regular expression exclusion. And so if you went to the crawl, this is where you would configure that regular expression. So this was use a pattern, a regex pattern, to exclude or include certain folders. That got a little too advanced for some of our implementers, and so we now added the ability to add folders. So you can add and exclude resources by the file path now, instead of just the regex, right? So if you don't have to do fancy regex, you can just do the file path. You can also just do a top level, right? So in this case, this top level resource execution, if you run it, it'll just do all the top level routes. So in this case, I have C, F, E. These are all the shares that I have on my file server. I've decided to exclude $, because I don't really care about it. And so when I do my next crawl, the $, will be excluded. So that's crawl scoping. If you scope the crawl, you can do it by top level resources. You can pick it each folder in the advanced, or you can do a regex. And if you do that, then it affects the permissions collection and data classification as well. And so there's also activity monitor scoping. There's two ways you can do this. So as we talked about, the activity monitor flow is it comes to the activity monitor, goes to the event manager, and then goes to the Elasticsearch databases. At the activity monitor level, you can set up what are called exclusions, and that's done through the application configuration. You have the ability to change your polling intervals once every 60 minutes. You can increase this if you want to poll less frequently. You can exclude certain extensions. So in this case, I've excluded exe, ICO, and these extensions because I know activities where the files have this extension are probably OS activities or activities that I just don't care about. I also don't care about the $, activities because that's something else. I just want to look at the shares in this case. And I also don't care about these system accounts. So this is an exclusion. This gets evaluated at the activity monitor level, but you don't have too much logic here. You just do users, folders, or file extensions. That's pretty much what you can exclude by at the activity monitor level. If you wanted more logic in your exclusions, you can do what's called a discard rule. And this is evaluated at the event manager level. So here you have a lot more context available. You have basically any attribute that you have available from either the identity source, identity collector, or any other HR source that you've added for the identity collection. You could use that, or any attribute that's part of the activity itself, or any attribute that's brought back by the data enrichment connector. All those are available here for you to filter on accounts. And you can set these as discard rules. These get evaluated at the event manager level because the event manager is what has that context of identity, Active Directory, identity IQ, et cetera, et cetera. The activity monitor is not aware of identity IQ or Active Directory. It just says, I got this activity, I'm going to send it to the event manager. The event manager does have the ability to reach out to other systems. So that's activity monitor scoping. You can exclude stuff at the activity monitor level. You can discard stuff at the event manager level. And then there's data classification scoping. So not only can you scope data classification by controlling what you crawl, but you can scope your data classification per resource. So in this case, if you look at my file server, I can come in here and add exclusions or inclusions, right? So the exclusions take precedence. So I can come in here and say, I don't have any resources. So I can come in here and pick specific folders to be excluded from classification, and I can turn on explicit folders for classification. That way you don't do the whole server. You can also launch on-demand classification tasks from the policy screen. You can do run resource classification, find the resource that you want to classify, and then run the classification on demand from here for a particular folder. So that's data classification scoping. And then there's a few more tips. So scoping is proper, right? So this is important because by default, we collect a lot of information. File Access Manager collects a lot of information. And that's because we want to have all the visibility into everything that's happening. However, from organization to organization, not everything might be interesting. So it's important to understand what's in scope, and then it's important to understand how to actually set that scope using these tools available. A couple more tips. Schedule and deletion of events to automatically maintain your database size. So if you go to the forensic screen, you can set up any activity filter that you want. This can be any filter that you could come up with here, and then you can set that up to be deleted. You could do that once on demand, or you could do that as repeating. So the idea here is you could set up a query filter that says, show me all the activities that are reads that are older than 90 days. And then you could say, okay, now I'm going to use that filter to delete all reads older than 90 days. And then I can just say, action type is delete. I put 90 days here. And so this task will run every day at 1 a.m. and it will say, are there activities that are older than 90 days? And then get rid of them. This way, the task runs every day and you don't need to, manually maintain your database size. The main contributor to the database size growth is the activities that are being collected, because if you don't delete stuff, then it just keeps growing. And so you have to delete stuff, but you don't want to delete stuff manually all the time. It's best to set up some kind of retention policy using this deletion. Configure system notifications to alert when services become unresponsive. So if a service goes down, if an activity monitor goes down, or if it can't talk to the agent configuration manager or the event manager, then you could set up alerts to be sent to somebody like a network operations team. And so if you have a NOC and you want to alert them whenever a service goes down, you have the ability to do that. They'll get an initial notification and then a notification every hour until the service comes back up. And then the last part here is we've seen customers leveraging existing SIM tools. So people are already Elasticsearch shops, or they have Splunk, or they have some other SIM tool that they're using to monitor a wide range of activities. You can definitely leverage that to monitor FAM. You can look at the statistics. You can see how many activities are coming in every day. You can look at the statistics to see if the permissions collections are performing fine. You can check out the logs to see if there's any errors. You could monitor the service health itself. You can do a wide number of things. You can also use a SIM tool to audit FAM, right? So we have auditing that's available. Anything that you do in the website gets audited and put into an audit table as of 8.0. And so you can use that and set alerts on that as well. And that's it. That's all I had. So I'm going to move on to the questions.
Thanks, Funny. Before we can start answering your questions, I would like to take a minute and mention how SailPoint Professional Services can help you with FAM. We can help you with a health check to review your environment and optimize FAM. We can help you with upgrading to 8.0. We have expert services, which is essentially a bucket of ours that can be used for any professional services help you need with FAM. It could be configuration, training, and so on. You can get in touch with your SailPoint Customer Success Manager or your Professional Services Engagement Manager to know more. All right, then let's move on to the questions now. Okay, we've got quite a few questions come in. Let's go over them. Yeah. When you mention more permission collection services to collect faster, do you recommend these services be installed on their own servers, or can they be stacked?
So that's a great question. So for permissions collection and data classification, by default, they are programmed to utilize as much of the server as they can that they're sitting on. So if a permissions collector is on a server, it will try to use as much of that power of that server as it can to complete its permissions collection task. So it does not make sense to put two permissions collector servers or a permissions collector service and a data classification service on the same server, because they would be competing for resources if they're doing the same task at the same time. So the recommendation is to put one collector per server, right? So not activity monitors, one PC collector per server and one DC collector per server. These are the heavy lifting services. They're going to try to use all the resources, and so you should just let them have a server to themselves. Activity monitors a bunch of them can go on the same server. That should be all right.
Okay, another question here. If the initial run of a data classification task makes it part of the way through and then times out, when you rerun the task, will it pick up where it left off or start over on classifying?
It will start where it left off. So for data classification, the way it works is the very first scan is a full scan based on your policies, and it will try, and your scope, it will try to scan everything. And once that first initial scan is done, we will have a date when we last classified it. And then based on that, we can use that information in the future to figure out if something is stale. So the next scan will look at the folder or the file and say, okay, has this been modified since the last time I scanned it? If the file has not been modified since the last time we scanned it, we won't scan it again, so it's stale. But if the task fails midway, it still knows a batch size too. So the RabbitMQ has a queuing mechanism where it just puts a bunch of batches into the queue, and the collectors will pick it up. And so if it fails halfway through and the next time you relaunch it, it'll try to resume from wherever it left off.
All right, let's move on to another question. From a performance perspective, is there, from a performance perspective, is there a calculator we can use to understand how many FAM servers would be required for a certain number of file shares?
Yes. So there's a combination of tools. So there's the first thing that you want to use is what's called a server data analyzer that we have. This is a standalone tool that it pretty much uses the same libraries as File Access Manager, but you don't need to do a whole install. It's basically a lightweight crawl, and it's a server analyzer. So if you have a file server and you want to find out how long that scan is going to take, you need to tell us a few things about that file server. And the best way to do that is to run the server analyzer tool. That will tell you how many folders, how deep the structure is, how much indexable data there is. And then using that information, we do have calculators as well to figure out how much database space that's going to take, and roughly based on certain assumptions of classification rates and scan rates, we can say this is how long we expect it to take to finish. Now, the activity monitoring stuff is a little bit more difficult to estimate because we don't know how many activities are actually happening on the endpoint. So the best practice in terms of activity monitoring is to stand it up and look at it for a few days and then analyze the activities that have come in and start putting in excludes and discards as soon as possible, so that you're only collecting relevant activities. And based on the number of activities you save per day, there's also a calculator where you can plug those numbers in and then extrapolate out, in number of days, how big your database is. Elasticsearch and SQL will grow. So yes, there exists a calculator. Yes, there's also a server analyzer tool to figure out how long the permissions and the data classification might take.
Okay, another question. Does activity monitoring need to be installed on the file server?
Only for Windows file server. That's the only service that needs to be on the file server, Windows file server activity monitor. Everything else is a remote on a FAM server.
Okay, another question. Do we have to crawl the entire file share every day to capture permission changes on a folder?
Permission change. So a few different things there. So the crawling is just discovering the resources. The crawling doesn't bring back the permissions. The crawling only brings back the resources, nothing else but some resources and some metadata. The permissions itself come from the permissions collection task. If you want to collect new permissions, then you'll need to, depending on how frequently you want to collect permissions, that's how frequently you need to run the permissions collection task. So if you want to see in the permissions, right, in your permissions forensics, if you want to see the latest updated information of exactly how it exists, that will be as stale as your last run. So if you want new information in the permissions forensics, then you'll need to do another permissions collection task. Now, you do have activity monitoring in place that will pick up permission changes as they happen. So if someone changes the permission on a folder, we'll pick that up as an activity. We won't change that permission in our permission tables until we do the next permissions collection task, but we will capture that permission change activity as part of activity monitoring.
All right. Thank you. Let's answer another question. What are the capabilities when it comes to OCR?
So OCR is turned off by default because it could be pretty intense, but basically we can, the data classification is set to look at certain documents by default, but you can extend that to PDFs and images and look at those images and try to understand if they're sensitive data by doing OCR or optical character recognition. And so that's just based on, like, if you turn it on, it'll go and try to scan images and PDFs that are kind of like images and look for policies that way.
All right. Another question. What are common symptoms of needing to add event managers? Should there be proper filtering in place?
Can you repeat that question?
Just a minute. Okay. Yeah. What are the common symptoms of needing to add event managers? Should there be proper filtering in place?
Okay, so I understand the first part. I don't understand the filtering part, so I'm going to try to answer the first part. I think what the question was, how do we know if we need additional event managers? You know by looking at the resources the event manager is using, right? So the quickest way you know that your event manager is having a problem is if you go to the event manager and you just server and you just kind of look at task manager. If your CPU or memory are like really high, and meaning like above 60%, then it's probably struggling to keep up. If you want an exact number or like an exact idea of if it is actually having a bottleneck or a performance problem, then you need to look at the event manager statistics log. There is a document that Julian wrote about what those statistics mean, but there are a few counters in the event manager and event collector statistics logs that indicate a bottleneck, and those are the queue sizes. So if events are getting processed but are not getting hung in a queue, or the queue is not growing, then the event manager is fine. But if the queue is growing and the event manager statistics logs are telling you that, hey, this queue is growing, I'm trying to process events, but there's this growing number of queue, then that indicates a problem with the event manager performance, and then you probably need to add an additional event manager at that point.
Okay. Let's take some more questions. We have around 10 minutes remaining. Let's look at some other questions here. Okay, just a minute. Let's answer this one. What changes can the file manager do on the file permission or file properties?
What changes can the
file manager?
Okay. So by default, the file access manager is a read-only tool, but you can turn on different things, right? So by default, we just read the folders and the permissions, but let's say you want to do access requests, then File Access Manager can provision access requests. There's different ways to do that. You can use what we have, what's called like a cleanup process through normalization, or you could use some other another way of provisioning access. But File Access Manager can change permissions through its access request or access certification features. So someone can reject something in a certification, and we can remove that through provisioning. But that you'd have to turn on. So if you want to change access, then you need to turn that on for campaigns and access requests. In terms of file properties, again, by default, it will just read the file properties. We will not change anything. There are certain hooks in place in the system where you have the ability to modify file properties. For example, you can run data classification, and as you discover certain specific sensitive information, you can choose to take action on the files where you find that. So let's say you find a social security number, a file containing a bunch of social security numbers. You can say when you find that, when the data classification finds that, you can fire off a script to go mark that file some way at the metadata and say this is confidential or this is secret. So there exists the ability and certain hooks in the system to go and modify file properties. Usually it's not done unless you know what you're doing with the files.
Okay. So we have time for a couple of more questions. Let's have a look at some. Let's answer this one. Is the server data analyzer tool downloadable, or does it come with the product binaries or install?
It does not come with the install. It's a standalone tool. It should be downloadable via box. I'm sure we can chase that down and send that to you, or see if it's already on Compass. I don't know if it's on Compass. I know there's a box link that's available for other people to download it, but I'm not sure if it's on Compass. But yes, it can be downloaded. It's not with the installer. It's a standalone tool.
Okay. Another question here. Are we going to see additional web user roles in version 8? For now, it's only been an admin role and a very basic compliance manager role.
I guess you're on a version below 8. So as of version 8.0, there are additional roles in the website. So there's 4 roles in the website by default in 8.0, which is administrator, auditor, data owner, and compliance manager. Before 8.0, each screen in the website was, you couldn't really customize what you could do. But as of 8.0, each screen in the website, every screen in the website has several back-end capabilities that go with it. If you wanted to give somebody an existing role, you could do that to an AD account or an AD group as of 8.0. But if you want to create a new role, the new role currently for 8.0 and 8.01 has to be created through the database. So if you want to make a new role, you have to do it through the database. But if you want to give somebody that role or a group that role, then you could do that through the website in 8.0 in the capabilities section.
Okay, great. Some more questions. We have around 5 minutes remaining here. Let's have a look at some of these. Let's answer this. You said activity monitoring is a service that gets installed, pulls every 60 seconds on an endpoint. Are workstations endpoints, or are your file servers endpoints?
When we say endpoint, we're talking about file servers, SharePoint, Exchange, Mailbox. We're not doing like actual endpoint like desktops and laptops.
All right. Another question. So this is regarding security IQ, FAM 6.2 and FAM 8. What is the difference between the two? And is it necessary to install, is it necessary to have 6.2 in place before you install some modules of, before you install FAM 8?
There is no version 6.2. So if you're on 6.2, then I don't know what you're doing. I don't know if there's an upgrade path. You might be talking about 6.1 Service Pack 2. And so there's a whole upgrade guide on Compass that talks about So basically the upgrade paths are 6.0 to 6.1, 6.1 to 8.0, 8.0 to 8.01. All of these upgrade paths have release notes and a guide on how to do the upgrade. They're all on Compass. So you can figure out, like, based on the release notes, you can see what the difference are from version to version. And then you can also look at the upgrade guide to see how each of those upgrades look like.
All right, all right. I think we are near the end of the session. Let's just take one last question, and then we'll call it a day. Let's have a look at some questions here. Okay, what is the retention policy for permissions collection?
Permissions collection. So every time a permissions collection runs, right at the beginning, we will look at what folders we have crawled and which are not deleted, and basically get rid of any existing permissions that we had at that point, and then go collect all the permissions again. So at the beginning of every permissions collection task for that application, we get rid of all the older permissions that we collected and collect new permissions for all the resources that we've crawled.
Okay. Let's take one last question. We have 2 minutes. If we are provisioning these permissions to AD, that can be done by configuring DN, but how do we get the groups that already have permissions?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So before 8.01, if you wanted to do access requests through File Access Manager, you have to go through our feature called normalization. And the reason normalization is basically saying we'll get to a folder, we'll look at all the permissions that exist on that folder, we will put them into 4 different buckets: full control, modify, read, execute, list for comments. We'll try to generalize those into 4 different categories, get rid of any permissions that exist today, add new groups, and then grant people memberships to those groups depending on the access that they had before. So normalization basically takes all the permissions that existed, cleans them up, and grants new permissions so that we are absolutely sure we are the only ones giving access to a folder, and we manage that group. So before 8.01, the only way to enable like automatic provisioning of access requests in File Access Manager was to normalize a resource, or what you call manage a resource. As of 8.01, there exists the ability to fire a custom script, basically any script that you want at the fulfillment level. So you can set things up to say, hey, somebody requested access through File Access Manager, that got approved. Once that gets approved, we fire off a script, and that script can do whatever you want. You can call out to ServiceNow, you can call out to Identity IQ, or send an email or whatever you want.
All right, all right. I think we're nearly at the end of our session. So I think, yeah. Any more questions out here? Let's take one last. Yeah.
So where data classification labels defined, that's under compliance and data classification. Who is the best resource to set up exclusion roles? This should be a combination of the implementer, the business, and the IT team at the organization. Any roadmap data for the next few patches. Service packs get released once a quarter. The next big major version release, I think, is Q1 of next year. So early next year will be. And is there any documentation on data classification? There's documentation on DC and PC in the form of administrative guides on community on the Compass side. RabbitMQ, a single Windows server. Yes, it's just one single Windows service, and that's it. You just need one RabbitMQ.
All right. That looks like all the questions that we have, and we're out of time. So yeah, I'd like to give a big thank you to Funny for presenting. Thank you so much. Like I said before, the session has been recorded, and we will email you a link to the recording on Compass. We will also post a slide deck and get back to you on your follow-up questions. With that, I hope everyone has a great day, and we hope to see you next month. All right, everyone. Goodbye. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.